ever think God is punishing you for something? Welcome to the Parable Podcast. I'm your host, Danielle Zapchenk, and right now you're going to meet founder of Project Lightwell, Kelly Carlson, discuss how God has used her chronic illness to bring light to a child's life.
I think there's just this really lovely validity of serving out of the hard, because we begin to see there's so many people in our world, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our homes who need the permission to still function out of their heart. I think when I decided, I want to be a woman who says, this is really tough, but I'm not going to give the reins to the enemy, because I knew that was the lie.
Here's my conversation with Kelly Carlson. I'm so excited to introduce you to Kelly Carlson. She is the founder of Project Lightwell. We are introduced by a mutual friend, another Kelly. And so I'm excited to meet you. Tell me a little bit about what you're passionate about, where you live, who's in your life, things like that.
Well, I live in Ohio, and my husband is a collegiate coach. And so our life is very active, and I have two daughters. One is in kindergarten and my other daughter is in first grade. So we're still in the earlier years, but just a lot of fun.
I think I noticed off of your Instagram, or maybe it was your LinkedIn, you were a teacher and you've worked with families before. So you have a passion for children. Is that right?
For sure. I was able to do a lot of college ministry after I started walking with the Lord, and got to know, begin a relationship with him in college. And then after that, I was privileged using art to actually go to various third world countries and be a part of areas of orphanages and brothels and help develop funding for those areas. And then when I was back in the States full time, I was a children's director and got married, and then was a preschool teacher at a large Christian school in Michigan. And then we started having kids, and I stopped that and was a full-time mom. And so
a worthy accomplishment, right?
Absolutely. But children have always been a part of my life.
Kelly, you said that you kind of connected or understood what Jesus was about when you were in college. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure.
What was your growing up? Yeah. Did you know who Jesus was? Was that something a part of your life, or was that in college it really set in?
I was really involved in going to a church and the traditional church things, and my family was involved. But even I was thinking just yesterday, I can remember when I was young, I would be doing skip it outside. But I can recall when I was young thinking I had to, do it a certain amount of times before my mom called us in for supper, or else maybe I was going to go to hell. I was very performance oriented,
wow.
And accolades were a big deal, and being involved in church and going on mission trips and choosing the right things. And I think on the outset, I could have been perceived as a Christian, but it was really a very moral, good choices life, afraid of being imperfect or not good enough, very much an achievement-based view of God. And then I was in college, actually, and I was on a summer trip with a bunch of college students. And I think I just got on that trip, actually, because I had the right answers about Jesus. But when asked some questions about salvation and eternity, and on what basis do we know that eternity is a promise, I had no answer. Yeah. And so it wasn't until college that really the concept of the freedom of heaven and eternity on the basis of Christ on the cross and his choice for his children being the basis of redemption, it was such an unfathomable concept that I was freed when I didn't realize that I was still kind of chained a little bit. So that was in college, in an amazing community of believers and seeing a difference. And since then, actually, my entire family has come to know and love Jesus in a personal way and areas of ministry. So
I love that idea, how you had that mindset switch where you were performance oriented and then you switched it onto Jesus, who had to perform. And I think we could do that for so many things. For some of us, whether you're achievement based or if you feel like you're just not good enough, he is all of those things. So I like that mindset shift. You said you were working in orphanages and brothels. And so I know you grew up in the States. So tell me what it was like to experience and to be just more open to, wow, there's a whole other world out there. What was that experience like for you?
It's interesting because this was in my 20s and even early 30s before I was married or before I had kids, which is a very different perspective and frame of mind to go to places where you see children in incredible suffering or poverty versus going there as a parent or as a mom and actually being able to see a little bit behind. We see things visually, but imagining and seeing the story behind that child or in that child's sphere, I think would have drastically changed if I went there today as a parent. But at that time, it's interesting. When I would come back to the States, I would feel really anxious and angry even. I guess just in some of the physical lopsidedness that it felt like so obvious in those places. But I had a friend encourage me and she just said, Kelly, your frustration with America or how you grew up or however in comparison is not helping much. But what if you were to live here as though you've been there? It was such a transformative thing for her to say to me because it's applicable to all areas of our life, even if we never cross a country border. But I think for me, it opened my eyes to the magnitude of need. Yeah. But even more so in all of my experiences, Danielle, I think being with the children was a greater gift than anything I brought to the children. Letting them smear peanut butter or ketchup on me or play with my hair or me sit down and teach them a tic-tac-toe or hold their hand and walk down the street. Granted, there are physical needs like buildings and safe venues for them to live and grow up in. But I think just having that human presence, right? When we bring the presence of Jesus, it is often in us just being present in people's lives in the hard things. Even if they didn't know, I don't think that a lot of the children, they didn't know how hard it was because they had never, C.S. Lewis talks about that. When you live in a puddle, you don't dream for the swimming pool because all you know is the puddle. And so I think that it was really eye-opening to me that one, there was a lot more joy and happiness than I ever would have anticipated because their joy was with human connection and relationships. And two, they weren't looking for me to show up and be magnificent, but just to stay, to endure alongside.
I think that's the beautiful part of serving and connecting with others is that when we think that we're giving, it's really what we're receiving in return. And I think that's such a beautiful gift because, again, it switches that mindset of like what you just talked about before. It's taking it off of us and knowing that we didn't have to do anything. It's not our plan. It's not our goals and our missions trip as we try to go to other countries or whatever. It's so good. Well, Kelly, I'd love to learn some more about your story, and we're going to transition into what you are the founder of later. But what's one of your parable stories that you'd like to share with us today?
Yeah, I think the biggest one, and it's so interesting because even just in this dialogue, everything just ties together, right? When we look backwards, the things that just seem so out of the blue are so formative actually in the Lord's intention, whether in its occurrence or whether in how he walks us through it. And so 7 years ago, I was pregnant with our first daughter when we moved to Ohio. And we moved into what we didn't know was a fraudulently flipped home, and it was filled with black mold. And so as a result of living in that space, and I was a stay-at-home mom with her, I felt very ill, so ill that some doctors said they didn't know how much time we had, and I perhaps needed to find someone else to raise Sophie. And others were accusatory that I was making it up or I was just a tired mom that needed a vacation. And so during that time, after I was sick for a very long while, is when the mold and those things were discovered, and we were encouraged to get out of the house. And so Sophie and I actually, as the baby, she was about 4 to 6 months at the time, ended up traveling to different doctors around the nation while my husband stayed here and renovated the home and went place to place. And Mayo Clinic was kind of our last stop before I was able to move back to Ohio. And I think during that time, and the story continues, but I do want to intersect here. Having had the opportunities to see God move so tangibly, both in the States and overseas, and to participate in children's lives and church ministry, and to dream of that being a long-term goal. And I felt like God had taken me off the scene because I was being punished for something. I hadn't yet gotten to a certain level. So this is where the skip it, the performance begins to bubble to the top of the crock pot again, was that I would never have said that I was performing for God's applause or people's applause. And yet when I was incapable of walking to the mailbox or feeding my child on my own, somehow my worth and value and purpose was being contested to such a degree that it sort of became a pointer, or like on a car, right? Like a light that maybe I wasn't actually standing on the ground of that which theologically I knew mentally, but had not yet been so shaken and tested in my life that I could say for sure my value and worth was upon what Christ did, and that God's view of me was based upon that as well. So during that time, I think my husband and I began to have these discussions where I'd say, what is it that Sophie needs to know? If I'm not here tomorrow, what does she have to know is true? And basically what began to evolve was the thing that I needed to know was true in the dark of the night, or in some invasive testing situations or doctor and hospital situations. And that was the fact that we're loved no matter what. The idea that it's not upon our performance or achievement or what we do for God. We are called to things, but our worth and value identity is not based upon that, and so I began to see when we're living for such a tiny gospel, we see such a small glory. And my gospel was so small. And although this was the start of some intense suffering or just a chapter of our story that we never wanted to have, it was also a bit of freedom as God started to tear back some of the curtain and some of the very human perspectives I had laid upon my worth and value. So in hindsight, those are not things that I want to pass on to my daughters. Yeah. Those are not things that we want generationally to continue. Those are not things that are going to press in on my relationship with God. They're actually going to cause a distance and a dissension. And so I can now look in hindsight, I can see God's goodness in allowing all of the things to such a drastic degree that I had been finding my significance and value on to be taken away, such that I would just lean into him. And to continue the narrative, when I moved back to Ohio, in an apartment, we had a home that was being built, and I started getting very sick again. And then, Danielle, I started craving baked beans for breakfast, which is really hilarious because I don't like baked beans. But the last time that I had craved baked beans was when I was pregnant with Sophie.
Oh, wow.
And so I was so very tiny. The doctors were trying to figure out if I could digest a bagel. And it turned out that God was building a baby simultaneously. And I was pregnant with Lucy, and all the hundreds of images of the testing at Mayo Clinic, and they missed the fetus. She survived all of these things. So we sent about 20 doctors around the nation these birth announcements that just said, look what God's doing. Like, we thought my body was dying, and yet God was building a life in the middle of it, and like, man, isn't that the gospel, right? Like, isn't that just what feels like an empty tomb, and it's like the salvation of the world is just about to erupt from it. So that's Lucy, but still chronic illness continued. And I can recall one day driving in our town, and I was feeling really awful, and there's PTSD and trauma and incredible counselors that have come alongside over the years. But I remember seeing this woman, she was smoking behind a gas station. And I remember it was one of the first times that I started feeling so angry and having this conversation with the Lord with like, why does she get to be healthy? What if she has kids? Like, why do I have to be the one who's, and so this is where some of my sin is coming out. And I just remember hearing so quietly in my soul, the Lord respond and say, but Kelly, you're the healed one. And I think that idea of Jesus coming for the sick and not for the healthy, he's coming for us, but that he came not as the healer of those who are whole, but those who are sick from the perspective of eternity and not from perspective of the finite, that I gave my life to Christ, not because he's going to let it be torn apart, for his glory, but that he cares more about my soul and ridding it of the ugly parts or the self-enthroned areas, such that I begin to see what's truly sick around me. And I live in the third world in the middle of Ohio. I don't need to go to Africa to see that. But I think I needed to be ridden of the ability for self-effort and self-glory and self-applause. It's really interesting that one of the toughest things for me to walk through was suddenly when I had this story that nobody wanted. Because when you get to be this girl that goes overseas and does these things and stands on stages and has these written accolades, everybody wants to be that. Mm-hmm. And I did not realize how much I wanted that applause, even if I thought it was holy because it made me realize I was following the Lord. Yeah. It was still a glory that God will not share and did not want to share, and would have been unkind to let me just live in that idea. Because that's, again, it's a very small dream, a small gospel, a small freedom. And so I think that when I suddenly had this story that kept a lot of others at arm's distance, I realized like, whoa, this is shaking me up. You know, I now have the story that nobody wants, and I'm speaking on suffering and not able to attend things instead of speaking on all these great accomplishments in areas of poverty, you know. And it reminds me of two stories, not necessarily parables, but in the Word, when the woman reaches out and touches the cloak of Jesus, and he says, "Your faith has healed you. Go in peace." And I used to camp out on that first part, your faith has healed you, right? Mm-hmm. But that go in peace part, if I'm really thinking about that narrative, that lady had to have gotten a paper cut and started bleeding another time. Who knows if she continued her cycle in the future and started bleeding again. She had to have doubted. I just can't imagine not. Like, what if it doesn't stop this time? What if it really healed me? And when God says, your faith has healed you, go in peace, man. I learned my faith healed me, but I went in anger. I went in fear. I went in panic. I went in trying to perform my way back into health, you know. And we used to have this math equation on our refrigerator for our children that it would say sad plus afraid equals angry. Because I would get so angry at times and it would come out of my kids. Yeah. I'd say to them, Mommy's feeling really sad about this doctor call or about this, and I'm feeling really afraid, and I need to give that to Jesus. And that just came out like, will you please forgive me, 2-year-old Lucy? Will you please forgive me, 3-year-old Sophie? Mommy has allowed my fear to turn into something that is not, you know. And so our girls now, it's amazing. I know that it's easy for us, I think, to always camp in the areas of, oh my gosh, I should have done better. Oh my gosh, I could have not screwed up as a parent, you know, rather than inviting God's grace to just overwhelm the situations in our insufficiencies. But now when our girls, someone hurts themselves in the playground, you can bet Lucy's the first one to go tell them, God will heal that. Jesus can heal that. Yeah. You know, or just what's the first thing that they know? God forgives. And I think all of those areas that if I camp out in what could have been or what I should have done different or why I might be being punished, I forget again that it's not performance orientation, that we are loved no matter what or valued or worthy. So good, Kelly. I think that you are correct when you hit it on the head, saying like, I have the story that nobody wants because, you know, you think about like, is this going to happen to me someday? Or like, this is where I envision myself going. Nobody says like, if we all like wrote our things on the cards, like a note card and threw them in the air and we had to like pick somebody else's, most likely we'd be frantically searching for our own because when we hear other people's stories just like this, you're like, okay, I'm good. I'm good. Yeah. I'd love for you to kind of speak into when you say performance. I think that's just, it's so easy for us to do that. And maybe it's even subconscious. We don't even realize that that's where we're headed or what we are doing in our jobs, maybe just in our relationship with God. How do we tamp that down? And I know we all have these core feelings that we're going to have to struggle with the rest of our life. How do you, for yourself, push that back and choose to say no to that daily? For me personally, like in the mundane, I'm speaking out loud the things that feel untrue to me, but that I know are true according to the gospel. God has made me a gentle mom. God has made me a gentle mom. God has made me a gentle mom, you know, and things like I'm a child of God, not on a basis of my performance. I'm a child of God on the basis, you know, there's so many books out there now that are starting to kind of braid scientific brain move, you know, how our brains work. And yet, you know, the gospel and just creating these new grooves in our brain when we've been so trained. And I can see all the way back to the skip it, you know, is just just, until I do this, I won't receive this. A very deservation type of exchange, and this exchange relationship with the Lord. So one of the ways I would say is this repetitive reminding myself of what is true. And some of that is actually speaking what feels least true of all, because God says it is, the Word says it is, brothers and sisters in Christ says it's true. I need to, drown that out. And it's interesting. One of my daughters, when she would have night terrors or nightmares, she'd say, "Mommy, will you please pray louder than the noise? Please pray louder than the noise." I think about that with frequency, because it's the noise that sometimes drowns out the quiet presence that the kids in Africa needed, that I needed in the midst of suffering, that we all need in the midst of our day and things vying for our attention, the distraction of the good in place of the holy and what's actually best. And so I just think that is another avenue, is praying louder than the noise. We created a prayer corner upstairs. It's just surrounded by chalkboard walls. And instead of me going there and think like it's only listed with the names of others. So I think one of the things too for even performance is getting my focus off of myself and praying over others to also believe those truths. And then I guess authentic community has been vital. Those 2 or 3 women in my life who love Jesus, and they want me to love and grow in Jesus more than they care about what I think of them in that moment, right? Like that's good, holy friendship. And they speak with a gentility and a grace, but they know my flesh and my Achilles heel is going to be a performance orientation. And they know the ins and outs of my life such that when I'm vulnerable with them, they're going to say, "Hey, Kel, you're slipping," or "No, this is not true," or "I'm going to check in on you tomorrow and see if you're pursuing that." And this past month, I heard a speaker, and she was speaking on our testimonies, and she said, our stories become testimonies when they're tested, but they become anointed when they are ridden of all the bitterness and unforgiveness that are part of them. And so I think that speaking the word and prayer and community are like the 3 pillars of stepping out of my performance for worth. But then I also think being willing to eradicate anger and unforgiveness or the blame shifting. It was a big day when I realized that what was coming out of me was actually uglier than what was happening to me. And I knew, like, this is holy. I don't like it. And God is doing such a magnificent healing, even as my outer body is still wasting away. And when we can say yes to that, not because I was in some heroic position, don't hear me say that. I was probably crying in a corner. But when we can say yes to that, we know the light is winning.
Kelly, for somebody who is in the midst of chronic illness, which, out of curiosity, are you still struggling with this? Will this be a lifelong thing for you?
Yes. Yeah. So we have, there have been cancer scares. There is limitations on things I eat and parts of my body that still don't work right, or blood tests that have not moved, on the Richter scale. I will say that so much of the battle, it is not to diminish the physical, so much of the battle is up here, is our mind. And so when I got sick, I was very physically sick, but I remember a man, we called him Mike the Mold Guy. I remember Mike the Mold Guy coming into my house, and he just said, "I just want you to know, like, your brain will never heal from this." And I remember telling him, "You don't know my God." Like, it just flew out of my mouth. And I will say that is the scariest and the hardest part, because we want to try to live every day as though we are blades of grass, and we want to live with intention. And yet it is a morbid thought that will be utterly distracting if we live as though we're going to get hit by a bus tomorrow, because that's a fear. And that's not how God wants us to live. Yeah. So yes, chronic illness is still an ugly label in our home.
Yeah. So for someone who is listening, who is dealing with chronic illness, you brought up the 2 stories, or, what the Bible verse of like, you still need to go in peace. And you're just like, oh gosh, like, but what if it comes back? What if this never leaves? What would your encouragement be to them? Because we're going to struggle with that doubt. It's like, it's so interesting that the human mind, like, we just forget so easily, right?
Yeah. I think one of the things that was really important that a couple of people over the course of a short period of time had brought up, unbeknownst to one another, was that I needed to start stepping into purposes that I had prior to being sick. I think it's really easy to think of before sickness and after sickness, and that can be after different things, before grief and loss and after grief and loss. Before, life certainly changes, but who we are is still who God made us to be, and the things that we delight in can still be delighted in. And in fact, I think because I was always bracing myself for the worst, I wasn't actually beginning to even see healing that was happening.
Yeah.
And so I guess what I would say is, if I believe that there are dreams and goals and excitements and passions that we've all got, and if walking in chronic illness, not to wait for this hard stop so that those can begin. I think there's just this really lovely validity of serving out of the hard, because we begin to see there's so many people in our world, in our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our homes, who need the permission to still function out of their heart. And so I think when I decided, I want to be a woman who says, this is really tough, but I'm not going to give the reins to the enemy. I'm not going to, I'm going to cancel a meeting if I need to be in bed, but I'm not going to decide that I'm done with, because I knew that was the lie that I was believing, And so I think stepping towards the fear and putting feet to the purpose, actually, it brings about a lot of the healing, because we're reminded, oh, God's not done with me yet. I need to not be done with me yet. And maybe there are some things that can only happen in the lives of others and in our world for Christ and just for the good.
Yeah.
Because I'm stepping out in the midst of the situation.
Well, you stepped out in a big way. You are the founder of Project Lightwell. So tell us where that came out of, dealing with chronic illness. How was that birthed?
I think for probably a few years, I, realized, well, I'm probably not going to, one, go be living in Africa, and two, I have two little kiddos to take care of, and that's my role and job, and I'm glad for that. But I also want to influence children in places and situations where my hands and feet can't go. And when my children were both young, each of them at 2 and 3, they both had surgeries for 2 different things, and they received these stuffed animals from the hospital. And these stuffed animals are just heroes. They still sleep with Doodle and Atlas, and they love to tell the story of how Doodle survived eye surgery and Atlas survived, and they're just these little victory items. So I was talking with my husband one day, and to go, this is where it sort of braids with our story is, I said, for children who are alone and afraid, it actually was a lot of my counseling and trauma, because one of the biggest traumas for me was fearing something bad would happen to me during the day and my kids would be left alone and afraid, or they would have to deal with not having mom tomorrow, and I began to heighten every situation to that. Stories in the news, I would land on the kids, and so I had a friend challenge me to step into the lives of those children that would not only, one, give me agency, but two, perhaps that's a need. And so I began thinking, I wanted my kids to know they were loved no matter what. Me as an adult, I need to know I'm loved no matter what, not performance, work, ethnicity, income, any of that. And so I thought, if I could create something like a stuffed animal that was not just a stuffed animal, but was actually like a loophole, like a vehicle for this message of light to get into dark circumstances surrounding children who are alone and afraid. Just due to various things and experiences overseas, a rabbit was significant. I'm not an extra rabbit lover or anything like that. And so I designed a stuffed animal rabbit that says loved in the ear, no matter what in the paw. And we actually support fair trade jobs for women in India. So that's where they're created and shipped from. And they're organic and herbal dyed just for the purpose of not excluding any child, whether that's because of a diagnosis or an allergy. And so the goal is that these would be, we want to create this dialect of giving. And so they're not purchasable. The reason being that we're not in the business of stuffed animals, but we want to create this dialect of seeing and saying the good that we, there are children who do not hear the message that they are made brave and amazing and loved no matter what, because they probably are being raised and surrounded by people that also haven't heard that message. Yeah. And both as a comfort, but also a preventative. We see children who are making bad decisions, or adults making bad decisions, some from small scales to tragic levels. And those persons don't believe that that is true of them, and so are trying to find their worth or are angry in other ways, and don't have things like the community or the counseling that I had. It's only grace that separates me from anybody who is making the decisions that are impacting people negatively. And so we just launched in June, but we've seen over 100 of these rabbits go out to children who have been nominated, hospitals, bereavement centers, and camps, and crisis nurseries. And yeah, we're just building relationships with organizations and corporations that want to be a part. But it is a neat thing. You know, the rabbit chooses the child. So a light well is when a hole is kind of made in a roof of a building such that natural light can reach an otherwise dark or unventilated space. And that's where we get the idea of light well, is we want to pave the way for light to reach children who are alone and afraid. And while we can't eradicate their circumstances, we can put light there. And while we're not a Christian organization by name, my hope is that one day the children will know from where the light come. And so the rabbit chooses the child. They receive a Lightwell box that says, "I'm with you." And there was if I may share, there was a story. I was in a pharmacy line, and it was a place of trauma. It was a place, it was hard for me, this pharmacy line. It was when I had just returned from traveling with Sophie, and there was a boy behind me, and he was on the spectrum to some degree and was saying to his mom, "What drives out the dark? What drives out the dark? What drives out the dark?" Now, this is 6 years ago, so this is way before Project Lightwell is a thing. And his mom said, "The light does." And he continued, "But where does the light come from? Where does the light come from? Where does the light come from?" And I remember being so afraid standing in that pharmacy line, wondering if I could drive home safely, that I was like white knuckled, and I just didn't turn around. And she said, "Well, it comes from the switch." And I remember getting in that car and telling Sophie, who is one, just like, "Kiddo, the light that drives out the dark, like, it does not come from the switch. It only comes from Jesus Christ." Like, and that light, like, that cannot be won over by the dark. And so my hope is that through these vehicles that pave the way for Christ's light to reach children in dark places, speaking these words of dignity over them, that whether it's already or yesterday or in 10 years from now, they can think back and be like, "So that's what that was about," so that they know from where the light comes.
Wow, Kelly, that's so powerful. I'd like for you to just to think back, because I mean, the great thing about parable stories is that we get a time to really reflect and to be like, wow, I have seen God move. And so to think back to that moment when, you know, your house is filled with mold and you're traveling to the Mayo Clinic, to see where God has taken you now. Like, what is, I guess, like your response, like, to God, like, just wholeheartedly?
I mean, it has been a transition. Yeah. I remember when I was in my 20s and I would pray. I was single, I'd sit in my home, and I would raise my hands and I'd wave it in the air like a kindergartner. And I'd pray to God, "Please pick me. Just please pick me to be just Jesus saturated. Like, use me, God, however you want. Just please pick me." And when I started to get sick, I felt so unpicked. I felt like intentionally removed and just like, I don't understand, you know? And now it is. Yesterday, I was walking through just a center for kiddos who have been violently hurt and abused. And I just felt so chosen by the Lord. Like, so, like, gosh, God, thanks so much that I get to be a part of these stories because of the worst pages of my story. Like, it just doesn't make sense. So if I had my choice, we never would have walked through that. You know, I'm not like, yes, I'm so glad that happened. I'm so glad my kids grew up with a sick mom who was really mad a lot, you know. No way. But I am so glad for the redemption of the Lord, who's been so consistent through it, that like it still answered my prayers, the 20-year-old waving my hand in the air, wanting to be chosen for great things. And so I think that while I definitely have my tantrum days, like, I think my communication with the Lord is a gratitude. And Danielle, Project Lightwell would never work if it was out of my performance orientation. People think I'm doing a rabbit stuffed animal business. My kids tell friends, my mom's doing the rabbit business. And I'm like, this is horrible. And that's where, not that it's simple now to be misunderstood, but in my 20s, it would have been devastating. Kind of like, I'm too good of a Christian to be doing something so tiny. And yet, for the Lord to have done as much as he already has in Project Lightwell, I thought it was going to be something so tiny, like in my city, like just something down the street. And it is growing and will continue to grow as I continue to rely on him. And I think for those who have chronic illness who are listening, I had to learn that when I am sick, I don't need to pretend like I'm not sick. I embrace it that day, and I trust the Lord for the things I'm incapable of achieving. And I pray that God just multiplies it than if I had been well that day. And so I think God is so aware of our limitations and he grows in our minds and hearts to a more rightful size and power of the Lord, even though we're still so short-sighted, when we accept the limitations that prove, that it's his work, not ours.
It's such a good reminder, Kelly, that we are chosen. We don't have to wait to be picked for the kickball team on God's side. Like it is always us. It is always us. And we don't have to do anything to perform or be good enough. So thank you for that reminder. If people wanted to get connected to you or learn more about Project Lightwell, how can they do that?
Online at projectlightwell.org. And my email is on there, just kelly@projectlightwell.org, reaching out. And then also it's just a sweet lane of, if people know children that they want to nominate to receive rabbits, we're shipping them out every week. And the children can register the rabbit, get birthday mail, they get letters that remind them of the truths about them, and build this relationship to remind them that they are, that they're loved and amazing and brave, and with hopes that they become adults that are kind and confident and whole, and so online is the best place to go, and socials as well.
Everything for Kelly will be listed in today's show notes. I just appreciate what you're doing and like the trajectory of where this is going, not only for yourself and your family, but for the women who are making these in India, for like the kids and their families, and like even the people that are in the hospital getting to, or wherever the kid is receiving this, to experience that and to know like, wow, somebody sees them. So Kelly, thanks so much for being on today's episode.
Thank you.
I love how God used everything in Kelly's life, from Skip-Bo to her time with kids in orphanages and brothels, and her working through her illness to be an influence in a child's life. To connect with Kelly or Project Lightwell, simply visit daniellezapchenk.com for details. And here are 2 reflection questions from our time with Kelly. Number 1, is it time to break free from the performance or fear mindset today? I'd love for you to journal about what Kelly said and how that connected with you. Number 2, when doubt is going to creep back into our minds, because the reality is it is going to, what can you set in place now to help you combat those lies of the enemy when they come up for you? One easy way you can support the Parable Podcast is simply by sharing this episode with a friend. If you could pass that episode along today, it really helps people find out about organizations like Kelly's and also these amazing parable stories. Thank you to my technical producer of a husband, Eric, for making us sound so fantastic today. That'll do it for today. I'm grateful that you took the time to spend it with me. Remember, your parable showcases how his light always disrupts the dark. We'll see you back again next week on the Parable Podcast.